Happy Juneteenth, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Terri Sewell, and I want to welcome you to a special Juneteenth edition of Terri Talk. I am so excited to be joined by historian and archivist Dr. Howard Robinson for an important conversation about Juneteenth, a day of celebration, reflection, and activism. Exactly 157 years ago yesterday, on June 19th, 1865, news of the end of slavery reached enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas, when Union General Gordon Granger announced Order Number 3. This marked a joyous and historic day for some of the last remaining slaves who were finally free from the bondage of enslavement, more than 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Early Juneteenth celebrations included church-centered community gatherings in Texas before spreading across the South. Since then, Juneteenth has been used to commemorate the end of slavery and, most importantly, to celebrate Black freedom. Last year, I was proud to join my colleagues in the House and the Senate in voting for the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act legislation, which, after being signed by President Biden, finally established Juneteenth as a federal holiday for the first time in the United States history. We in Alabama's 7th Congressional District know the price of freedom is not free. It is paid for by the sacrifices of all those who dreamed of a better future and were willing to risk it all to make it a reality. That's why Juneteenth must be more than just a day of celebration. It must also be a day of reflection and activism. It is incumbent upon each of us to protect the progress that we've made, advance that, and acknowledge that it's not enough. We must act to do all we can to hold on to progress and to advance it. While the federal recognition of Juneteenth is a significant and symbolic step, we must fully deal with the injustices of our nation's painful past. The reality is that African Americans have continued to face systemic racism since we were recognized as full citizens more than 100 years ago. From the lack of affordable housing, to health disparities, to police brutality, to police violence, gun violence, voting rights, and the fight for racial equity and justice, we continue to be called to action. Now is the time to recommit ourselves to the critical work of eradicating these disparities and see that our nation live up to its promise of liberty and justice for all. Well, today I'm very excited to have with us and introduce our very special guest, Dr. Howard Robinson. Dr. Robinson is the Associate Library Director for Archives and Cultural Heritage Services at the Alabama State University, where he also teaches history and political science. Dr. Robinson specializes in African American history and has written extensively on the student protest movement of the 1960s, especially the activism on the campus of ASU. Dr. Robinson, thank you so much for being here today and for all that you do to not only make sure our history is known, but that we not only educate others, but we understand our place in history and the importance of moving it forward. I want to start with a very simple question to you, sir. What does Juneteenth mean to you?
Well, I really struggled with Juneteenth for a long time, but to answer your question very succinctly, it means another step towards the promise of freedom, equality, and justice in the United States. That's in short what it means. Yes. I think when you look at it, because it was localized in its inception to Texas and the coastal Texas and Galveston. But I think what the movement towards a holiday actually prompts us to reflect on is that this nation founded on these ideas of liberty and justice and equality and the equality of man and the equality of opportunity. Yeah. And so the United States couched itself on the world stage as a bastion of liberty and freedom,
Yep.
while at the same time enslaving 4 million people. And America could never live up to its promises as long as it harbored and sanctioned this insidious institution. And so, what I think this holiday represents for all Americans is that it is a time to reflect on living in a nation that has its shortcomings and its failings, but it's moving steadily towards, and with some interruptions, moving towards this idea of liberty and justice.
I couldn't have said it better. I also think that it's important to note, as I said in my introduction, that we in the Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes the historic cities of Montgomery and Birmingham, my hometown of Selma, we know the sacrifices that were made, and we know that the price of freedom is not free. My question to you is, how do we talk about Juneteenth in the context of not only slavery, but then segregation and Jim Crow? And then, we've sort of, as you said, it's been a steady movement towards equality and justice. We obviously have come a long way, but we, of course, still have a long way to go. And frankly, I think all of us were smacked with that reality. Some of us knew about it way before, because we live it every day, when George Floyd was killed. And so all of a sudden, in the midst of this pandemic, we saw this uprising and this awareness and consciousness of white America in a way that we hadn't seen prior. I can tell you that as a member of Congress, we passed legislation on the House side called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which languished on the Senate side and never became law. The same is true with gun violence legislation. The same is true with voting rights legislation. So I feel like in my space, legislatively, the biggest success thus far has been in getting Juneteenth to be a federal holiday. But you and I both know that it's not recognized by every state in this union as a holiday in that state, and that in and of itself is also problematic. Can you talk to us about the movement from slavery to segregation to where we are today?
Well, I think that I think you're absolutely right. And to have this conversation from the Black Belt, Montgomery, like Selma, is in the Alabama Black Belt, and in a Black Belt that's not only called the Black Belt because of the color of its soil, but because the high concentrations of people of African descent in this region, and it was notorious for the wholesale exploitation of Black people within that institution of slavery. And so this idea of celebrating emancipation resonates, I think, in the Black Belt as much as it does anywhere else in this nation. Mm-hmm. But then this region has also been instrumental in this study march towards really realizing all of the promises of freedom. So you would think that people of African descent would be afforded all of those constitutional rights that other Americans enjoyed. But that's been a long and arduous battle, and it's interesting because even when you talk about the voting rights legislation, that Selma and Montgomery sort of are joined because of this Selma to Montgomery march, in which sort of catapulted the idea of voting rights across this nation and across the world. And so even when you talk about that, it's again Alabama where you see the efforts to erode the Voting Rights Act of 1965
with the Shelby decision.
The Shelby decision in 2013. And so we are still, I think, on the battleground in this quest to move the United States closer to this idea of liberty and justice. And so I think that these battles have to be fought. It's a bit sobering that they have to be fought again and again.
Yeah,
That
old battles have become new again. I mean, I would have never thought that 57 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that the cause for which John Lewis and those foot soldiers marched and were bludgeoned on a bridge would become my cause too. Because as you've said, progress has been the steady beat of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And that every generation has to be vigilant in protecting the progress of the past and then doing our very best to advance it. And so, why is it that we should be hopeful about this process?
wow. Well, one of the I think Martin Luther King said the moral arc of the universe is long but bends towards justice, and I think one thing is the faith of people, American people, of Black people, to believe that although there are these challenges and these obstacles, that we are that the moral arc of this nation is moving towards justice. And so if that's in fact the case, then you have to put up this fight. You have to be engaged in this battle, um, and whatever your part may be,
Yeah.
because to move that moral arc towards justice is going to take many hands and much effort. So I see Alabama as really again at the focal point of the new challenges to citizens and citizenship, and the opportunity to move this nation again closer towards this ideal that it pronounced in its founding documents.
Right. So, why is it so important that we preserve this history, painful as it is? Why is it important to preserve it? I know that for me, being the member of Congress representing this amazing area and this amazing history, it's my job to represent the people who are there and live in this district today, but also to protect that legacy of this of what happened here, be it the Montgomery bus boycott, be it the Civil Rights Act of 64 or 65, that people in our district paid a heavy price for the progress that we are seemingly enjoying now. And we do enjoy it. I mean, the reality is that Amelia Boynton Robinson ran from this seat that I have in 1965 and lost, so that I could in 2010 win. And that was a long time. But it's not enough to have one representative. We've got to kick down the doors and have many more Black representation across every elected office and every elected branch. But having said that, people often ask me why I spend a lot of my political capital in Washington raising money and getting federal funding for preservation of these enormously important historic sites, which are deteriorating before our very eyes. The historic churches, the historic campuses like ASU. Why is it important that we preserve this history? And what place does what place does the students who currently are on the campus of Alabama State and the young folks today play in that process?
Oh, it's an enormous place. If anyone doubted the potential for young people to mobilize and address contemporary issues, you just have to tune in over the last 2 years, particularly the last summer during the explosion of protests, not only here in the nation, in the United States, but in over 60 countries around this world. And so I was taken aback. And we at Alabama State, the Levi Watkins Learning Center has an oral history project. And one of the things we did was to capture the voices of young people who had come back to Alabama State after the pandemic and had participated in those protests in the different places that they lived in the United States. And it was interesting to hear those voices and to hear the students who are really cognizant of the issues and understand what their potential is in changing this present trajectory. So, but I'm enlightened by this. Students come to the I've had students come to the archives who see a social injustice and want to understand what the strategies that were employed or used by former students. And so they want to see the SNCC papers. They want to see the papers of those students who participated in sit-ins and the freedom rides. So they're interested in learning from that experience. So, and then when they look at those papers, they see how really thoughtful the student movement sort of became of the 1950s and 60s, became much more sophisticated over time. And
they were strategists, they were tacticians. People think that by happenstance we were in Selma or the Montgomery bus boycott took place. No. These young folks, as you rightfully say, it was a young Martin Luther King, a young student activism of Diane Nash and John Lewis and others. But that really made the difference. And so I'm encouraged by what you're saying. The young people came to the archives to see, what went on. And so what were their reactions?
Their reactions, it was interesting. They saw how, exactly what you said, how important it is to organize amongst the students, to be clear about what their goals are, what they want to accomplish. To have a strategy to communicate effectively. And so they learn these lessons from the students of the past. And so, and even with the National Park Service and its historic trail that has you have an interpretive center in Selma, you have one in Lowndes County.
And Montgomery.
And one here in Montgomery.
Yeah. I think it's befitting that the one in Montgomery actually is on the campus of the Alabama State University.
Yes, and so by visiting these three sites, you get to see how young people and high school students and the Courageous Eight and other folks in Selma organized for years, and then mobilized around both the student and SNCC and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Then later on, organized around the SCLC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in King, and then you get to see near near tent city in Lowndes County, how people were displaced because of their commitment to the franchise to vote. And you get to focus on that march between Selma and Montgomery, that 54-mile march. Mm-hmm. And then in Montgomery, you get to see, both the student protests that occurred in Montgomery, the celebratory participation of stars from everywhere at the city of St. Jude, and then that final culminating march where King gives his "How long, not long" speech at the state capitol, and then the resulting, most importantly, the resulting 1965 Voting Rights Act. So you see how these people see how these different constituencies work towards one common goal, and then and accomplish that goal. And I would say today that goal, that is the biggest difference between the 60s, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and what happened in 2020 and 2021 is that the resulting legislation wasn't realized.
Yeah,
had that George Floyd Act passed, had the
Voting Rights, John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed. You're right.
Then I think you would be talking about this movement on par with what happened in the 50s and 60s. And so the legislative piece is important.
Absolutely. So what do you see as the biggest obstacle to the struggles we have today?
The same obstacles. It's the same obstacles. And this is one thing where you have to be students of history to see that Black people and people of color today are facing the same, not only obstacles but tactics. So just like Black people in the aftermath of the Civil War, who had participated and shed blood in the Civil War, 200,000 Black soldiers fought in that Civil War. 20,000 or close to 40,000 in all Black soldiers perished in that war. And a nation fought its most cataclysmic confrontation to end the institution of slavery. It was critical. And then there was the question of, do Black people, do these former slaves participate in the body politic? Do they participate in this democracy? And they did for a short period of time, and
The
then
Reconstruction.
no,
But
and then
then that's when we got our first Black members of Congress, right?
right,
Was
right.
during but that was because white folks abdicated. They chose not to be in the electoral process for a period of time, as you rightfully said. And
And
but
and
it's a
and they
whole generation.
and they really didn't. At no point did they really acquiesce to Black political participation. They
That's
were
true. Now that's
forced
true.
out of participation in Louisiana. As Black people lined up to vote, white folks rolled out a cannon and pointed it at the people in line to vote. It's been a consistent and constant struggle to acquire the right to participate in the political life of this nation, and then to keep that right. And so you see it growing out of this Juneteenth celebration of liberty, as Black people are wanting to embrace the what it really means to be a citizen, right? And so that struggle, I believe, is still taking place. And so we, this nation has its work cut out for it. But I believe it's moving in that direction. And I think it will get there at some point.
So, what do you say to those that see cities like Montgomery and Birmingham with Black mayors, and we had, of course, the election of Barack Obama, and now we have Kamala Harris sitting as vice president, and say, well, yes, we have achieved a level of Black equality and a level of Black freedom, and really question our premise that we're not there yet, but that we are constantly in this process, and the process is a long journey, but we haven't gotten to the end destination.
Well, and I think that you're in the ideal position to say, or to say, or to understand how important Black leadership is, right? How important having that voice is. And so people might have an expectation that you're going to be able to change the system dramatically and drastically, that benefits them
And immediately. They want it immediately.
Right? But the reality is that you're doing the work, and so we worked at the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture on campus at Alabama State. We worked with local state representative Fab McClammy before he passed away.
Yes.
We worked with Representative John Knight, with when he was Representative Quentin Ross. He was a state senator, and so working with these Black elected officials, working with I served on a committee for Mayor Stephen Reed, and so to see how their representation is making a difference in the lives of the citizens of the communities that they represent, right? Seeing how this Black representation is making a difference, is giving a different voice, providing a different voice, and so I lament those people who are so distant from the process that they think that this doesn't make a difference or doesn't have an impact, and it does. And so I think one of the things that young people previously, and I think young people today, are saying, well, not only do we have to vote, right, but then we have to be there to insist that those who we vote for, represent our interest, and that they're supported in a very visible and very overt way in their positions at the city council, the county commission, at the state legislature, and in Congress. And so certainly the protest did that. It invigorated a nation, and it prompted passage of ideal pieces of legislation out of the House. And so we need to get a little further to have this come to fruition in the Senate.
Yeah. To say I was disappointed that the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which I am so honored to help draft and the lead sponsor of. And it carries the name of John Lewis. And when you think about Republicans and Democrats, how often they would come back to Alabama with John on his annual pilgrimage. And almost to a person, they have in their office that picture of them and their family with John on the bridge. And yet, here was an opportunity for them to put in practice this belief that John had in a beloved community, and uplift the piece of legislation, the signal, the significant, a seminal piece of legislation that bears his name, that is about voting rights. And for us not to be able to get the 10 votes on the Senate side that we needed just to have the John Robert Lewis Advancement Act come up for a vote. Mm-hmm. Now, we knew that we had the 51 with the vice president breaking the tie to actually pass it in the Senate. But the Senate has archaic rules, many of which of these Senate rules came out of Jim Crow era. And that rule was that in order to stop debate and call for a vote, you need 60 votes in the Senate. And we had 51. And, it's hard not to feel, I don't want to get emotional about it, but it is a legacy that is so important that we advance and that we actually get it passed. And I know that I told all of the activists, we can be mad, we can be downright upset, but what we cannot do is give up. Right. Because, giving up means it will never happen. What we have to see is that through our efforts, every effort, it is chipping away at those barriers that exist. And if you think about, if John and those foot soldiers and Amelia Boynton and F.D. Reese and if they had been so discouraged from being bludgeoned that first time and didn't come back that second time, turn around Tuesday, or the third time, we wouldn't have had a march from Selma to Montgomery, right? And so, ours is a different journey, but it's the same methodology.
Well, I don't know that it's a different journey, because I think about the mindset of a person who has been liberated from another person claiming total control over their body, their person, their family. A person's been liberated from that. So when you look at the Juneteenth flag, and you see the burst and the horizon, and both of them speaking to new beginnings and speaking to the possibilities of a future in freedom. And so those folks, as they rejoiced around the news of their emancipation, but think about that generation and what they anticipated, right? What they wanted to see for their children and their great grandchildren. And that's what is in our hands. It is, and when I say our, I say it's in America's hands, right? Is to move this nation towards embracing what aspirations those folks coming out of enslavement had for their future, right? And so they rejoiced. But then, over time, a different type of reality set in, and so the full citizenship was delayed, for a century delayed, and so we are now, moving to sort of make sure that job is finished, that the realization of that dream that our forefathers and mothers had at emancipation. That they've handed us this baton and said, we need you to bring this nation to the full meaning of its pronouncement. So I see, that's what I think about when I think about Juneteenth, and it's both reflective, but it's also forces us to examine ourselves and our nation.
Absolutely. For me, when someone asked me what I think of Juneteenth, and I think of the fact that we come from amazing stock. The fact that African Americans that we came over in the we survived the Middle Passage. I think of, I think of Maya Angelou's poem, "And Still I Rise." It said, out of the bowels of history, we rise. Like, you may trod me down in history, and still I rise. And I think that to me, it talks about a level of survival, a level uh, of of freedom, of think about the faith that our foremothers and forefathers must have had, that allowed them to endure all that they endured to get to this place where we are now. And while it is not where we want to be, it's a far cry better than where they were. But as you said, this is, instead of seeing this as a destination, it is a continuum. The journey still continues. It's our journey. It's our generation's time to put our imprint on it. And so, as a proud Alabamian, we in Alabama often want to forget our very painful past. How do you, in teaching history, African American history, America's history, how do you talk about Alabama and its place in history, and how do you place Alabama in the current context for this fight for equality and liberty?
Well, because I teach at a historically Black college in in Alabama, and in the Black Belt, and let me just say this. So I teach. It's sort of like some of my classes I could teach like a laboratory. So we could do a day in class, and we could do a day at the Freedom Riders Museum, at the Selma Montgomery, Interpretive Center, at the Dexter Avenue King, to go to Dexter Avenue King Memorial, the Parsonage House.
Oh yeah.
And to play a recording of his sermon, where he talks about having this conversation with God while he sat at his kitchen table, right? Yeah. And to be looking at that kitchen table, and in that space in his house, so we could talk about the Black experience in ways that are far more tangible than in many other places around this nation. And so I think that not only that, but then, I could bring people into the classroom, or bring my class to people who have participated in these heroic episodes in our experience. And so they get to hear these people firsthand. And so I think for some of our students who attend Alabama State University, particularly those who come from other parts of the nation, but also those who are right here and sometimes take for granted their history, or what's in proximity to them, to have a tangible way to see the lens of history through these places, right, and these people. And sort of know that there are museums and monuments and markers that tell a story, and that all you have to do is sort of understand where you are and pay attention to those voices. So that I think helps. But on another sense, and I see this in talking to students, because we have these conversations. We have classes that deal with Black identity and the civil rights movement and all these other topics, and it's invigorating talking to students and having them engage the literature and having them see them discuss these issues. But it's also engaging to see them have these conversations with each other, right? Yes. And so I think that we also encourage students to engage each other in these discussions and debates. And so you could talk about trivial stuff sometimes, but at some other times you have to be engaged in some serious conversation. and you have to talk about the issues that are impacting our lives and how you could intersect those issues. And so Alabama, Montgomery, Selma, the Black Belt offers an opportunity to have these conversations, and with in a backdrop that is almost unparalleled.
Absolutely. I also think, and would love your thoughts about this. So often we in Alabama try to run away from our painful past. But frankly, when you think about this nation and the context of equality and justice, so much happened right here in Alabama. And to me, my hope is that Juneteenth will offer another opportunity for all of America, not just Black America, but all of America, to really understand, what took place in this country, to celebrate the progress, but to acknowledge our shortcomings and then rededicate ourselves to making it better. What do you say to those? And I know that you're blessed to be around, to be at the Alabama State University, and you get to teach it to students who it matters to. But why should white Alabamians as well as Black Alabamians care about Juneteenth and our history, the history of African Americans in Alabama?
Because they want to believe that America is the land of liberty and justice and freedom. They want to believe that, the white students, who participated by the thousands, yes, in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. They came for Mississippi Freedom Summer. They came to Selma and participated in the Selma.
Sit-ins, yeah, all of
sit-ins,
that.
Mm-hmm. Freedom rides. They came because they saw where the nation was not living up to its pronouncements, and they were ashamed of that, and they felt like they could do something about it, right? And so they joined hands with their black colleagues, and they did something about it. Just like in the Black Lives Matter protest. My wife and I sat back and looked at protests happening in cities where there were no Black people.
Well, we had a protest in Mountain Brook here in Birmingham, and it was marvelous to witness. And at the end of the day, we, as John Lewis would say, we may have come on different boats, but we're all we may have come on different ships. We're all in the same boat.
Yes.
Today. And it's because of that legacy that I ask all Alabamians to embrace this wonderful opportunity for us to celebrate, but reflect, and then to hopefully rededicate ourselves to that premise in our Constitution that all men and women are created equal, and that we do strive for this equality and justice for all.
And what is the alternative? Like, yeah. You don't want to celebrate freedom, right? Is that the alternative? And so for Americans to embrace a time where we could reflect on this nation throwing off the shackles of enslavement and moving towards a more perfect union, moving towards the beloved community, as King would call it. That is a time to celebrate. So the celebration may take on different complexions for Black people, but other people in the United States, all other people in the United States, could celebrate that that the nation that they are citizens of took a giant step towards realizing, freedom. And so people talk about their freedoms, but this was a critical move, a critical watershed in the American experience. And so I think it's something that everybody should celebrate.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for your eloquence and your putting us into the historical context, placing Juneteenth in the historical context. And really, I hope all who are listening will feel a special call to action, that as we celebrate Juneteenth, I hope all of us, irrespective of our race and color, and ethnicity will embrace Juneteenth as a day to celebrate freedom. American freedom and liberty is what we stand on in our country. And we can only do that when each of its citizens take that promise to heart and act upon it. And so that's my hope for all of my constituents in Alabama's 7th Congressional District. I hope that you've enjoyed a good Juneteenth. I hope, like I did yesterday, that you saw the celebrations around the country that took place for Juneteenth, and that you do reflect and rededicate yourself to that great American notion of liberty and freedom and justice for all. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for your wonderful comments and for being here on Juneteenth.
Thanks for having me.